Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is the Beneath the Transaction podcast. I'm your host, Chris Pineda, and have another amazing episode today. I look forward to all of our episodes, but today specifically, this one is really branching into a new realm of conversation that I want to get into more because it's a heavy part of my book, which is this Indigenous connection that my book has back and forth every single chapter. I'm comparing not only my research and modern day literature around leadership and transformation, comparing it constantly to Indigenous culture and ritual and custom and meaning that is personal and near and dear to me. My father's from the Philippines, so I reference a lot of Indigenous elements to not only the Philippines, but all of the Asia Pacific diaspora. So that's going to be the main point of our conversation. I'm excited to introduce our guest, Arthur Soriano. To me, it's Kuya Arthur in the Philippines. You always address your elders with a title, and Kuya is older brother. So to me, he's Kuya, and I'm excited to have him on today. Igorot Sky is his handle on Instagram, and he has nearly 30,000 followers and has amazing content. And that's how I met him. It started popping up in my feed over and over, and it was teaching me about Filipino history, pre-colonial history. He also has a website called precolonialphilippines.com and comics and graphic novels, Maharlikan Chronicles, which also you can find on Instagram. And anything that I'm missing, he can fill in the blanks. Arthur is a self-taught historian of pre-colonial Philippines. He's just read a ton, and he'll tell you more about that, to try to understand the Philippines, not only now, because I say modern Filipino culture. I think there's a modern Filipino culture, and then there's this indigenous culture. Most Filipinos know their modern culture very well. I was raised understanding a fair amount of modern Filipino culture from my dad, but he did not know much of the indigenous culture, and I've made it a point in my adult life to learn as much as I can, and when you read my book, you'll see how much I try to integrate that. But Arthur, tell us more about yourself and your story and what put you on this journey, why you developed a passion around it, and kind of what you've just a high level view of the things that you've learned along the way. And then the point of this conversation is I want to get into how can we learn from indigenous cultures to help us live beneath the transaction today in the present? What can we learn from these past cultures of our ancestors to help us live better lives right now? That's the overarching question. But Arthur, tell us more about yourself, and let's jump in.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me on the podcast, Chris. I consider it an honor to know, study, and spread the knowledge of our culture and history. I guess it all started with a youthful exuberance towards ancient cultures. I always was fascinated by the Lord of the Rings scenes with, warriors fighting with swords and arrows, not guns and bombs. It just didn't have the same appeal to me when warriors were using modern weapons. So with that, at the university level, I studied a lot of classical civilization and history, classical civilization and history of the Greeks, classical civilization and history of the Romans, and that's what kicked it off. At some point in time, I felt, hey, what's going on with the Philippines? I want to know about the classical civilization of the Philippines and history. And I felt the proper way to start that research was to look up everything I could before 1521, before 1565, when the Spanish first visited the Philippines and when they landed and started to colonize. So that would be anything before the 1500s generally, but of course you can learn a lot from reading in the 1500s. And unfortunately, if you read the most popular Philippine history books, you get very little before 1521. And so that's a little bit sad that you can't find it. But if you dig, you can actually find quite a bit. But you're not going to find it from any Philippine history book per se. You're going to have to look at the history of Vietnam, the history of Indonesia, the history of China, the history of Japan, the history of the island people, And there's something that historians don't like. They don't put a lot of weight on oral history. But when you tell the story of the Filipinos, we didn't do a lot of writing that survived. So we need to put more weight on the oral histories. Now, of course, if they said some guy jumps from one island to the other, you're not going to take that literally. But if he says you used to roast pigs on a certain night or something like that, then that's believable.
Yeah,
Why
yeah.
would you doubt that? So I don't discount oral histories.
Well,
I
a
take
lot of the island cultures didn't write. They didn't have
right.
written history. It was all oral. So
Yeah,
all oral
they
history.
didn't have a lot of paper. There's not a lot of trees, or their trees, just didn't produce the same kind of writing material. But, the thing is oral history is history to me. But, the Westerners, they consider only things written down as history. And so that's where the big divide is. And I would put the weight of my ancestors, what they say, I would put a lot more weight on that than what some guy wrote down, in 1565. Put them both together, actually. They both count. But I don't discount the oral history. Now, one of the things that I'd like to say, and I was gonna say a little bit earlier, is I didn't study Philippine pre-colonial history for money. I didn't study it for pride. I just studied it because I was just so interested. And I think when you ask me about our history, what you're gonna get is probably the best history that a Filipino can get, because I'm going to look at things from our point of view. I'm going to look at things regarding our culture, how I see it transform or integrate, because it's a daily thing for me. It's sort of, yeah, it's a passion. And I only slowed down on my passion because I still got to eat, so I got to find other ways to make money. I couldn't put as much time into it as I had in the past. But definitely, I love reading about our culture and our history. So that's a good start. Maybe a little bit long. So
No,
I'll let you begin with your questions.
no, it's a great background, and I think we're similar in our passion for it. You've been, I imagine, doing research on this much longer than I, and when I went on to your website, precolonialphilippines.com, I mean, a couple of these books I own and I've read, but you've given me more of a reading list to just dive into, and I like how you put it in chronological order. But for me, it was very much a personal pursuit to understand my culture that isn't the modern Filipino culture. Again, that's kind of normal to me. My dad taught me, we were kind of raised in this dual culture household. That was normal. That was everyday life. Just basic principles, basic things, words that we used, or simple gestures like manopo when I would see Lola. The food that we'd eat, how we'd eat the food. Little things like that were all normal. But I became so intrigued by this indigenous culture as an adult and wanted to understand more about my identity, wanted to understand where I came from. Because if you look at my family tree, my mom, she's Anglo, so German, or, all European, Scandinavian, lot of written record. And so a lot of family history that dates back hundreds of years, generations back. And on my dad's side, maybe a couple of generations back. And I almost developed this longing to understand my ancestors and where they came from. And I've always been connected to a lot of island culture. I lived in Hawaii. I have a lot of friends from Samoa, from Tonga, from New Zealand, from Fiji. And I just found this sort of connection to their cultures without even knowing it, that I just felt like it was home to me. Well, the best example, and I talk about this in the book, is, and maybe this can kind of launch us on some of the questions that I have for you, but I was introduced to this gesture of breath of life by my Maori friends from New Zealand. It's called hongi in New Zealand, and they still practice it today. And in fact, whenever I see these dear friends, that's how we greet each other. And I was so taken back by this gesture of breath of life, pressing your forehead, your nose together, sharing this intimate breath. It just changes your connection with that person. You remember it always. You feel something. It's sacred almost. And I was so connected to that. I felt like this isn't a foreign culture to me. I didn't have the words to express it. This feels like this is part of who I am. It was almost like this sort of spiritual connection to it. But I still, in my mind, I thought, that's Maori culture. I'm not Maori, right? My ancestors from the Philippines. It didn't happen until years later. I was preparing for a speech, actually, and I was always talked about hongi. I always talked about the breath of life. And I was reading some of Lane Wilkins' work. And I know that you referenced a couple of his books. And it's actually an article that he wrote. And Lane Wilkin is, another sort of self-proclaimed historian of the Filipino culture. And I came across this gesture of ongo, and the same exact gesture, the pressing of forehead and nose to one another and sharing the breath of life. It's now kind of moved where a lot of modern Filipinos, they kind of sniff each other when they kiss. They kiss each other's cheeks and they smell each other's cheek, and it's this sort of still intimate gesture. But I was almost, it brought me to tears, Arthur, to be honest, when I read that, because I learned something about my ancestors that I didn't know, but that I already knew, if that makes sense. I didn't know it here in my mind yet, but I felt it for over a decade in my heart, that I just knew that that was part of my ancestry. And my ancestors did that gesture. And I started to feel this new connection to them that I'd never felt before. That day I ordered books online. I mean, I started to become this, I became obsessed with learning about this indigenous culture of the Philippines. That's what's kind of put me on the journey. I was connected to the culture before, but that really helped me become obsessed with it. And then I started integrating it into my work in leadership development and culture building within organizations. So I love that, what you brought up, that we we don't we don't know as much as we could know, and there's not a lot of places to look, and you do have to dig for it. It's not just easily accessible. Even modern Filipinos today, my dad and my family included, don't know a lot of these things about their own culture. And I shared with you when I went back on a trip to the Philippines a little over a year ago with my dad. We were on kind of this homage trip, learning about it. That was the point of the trip. We went up to Baguio, and we met with a couple of leaders in the Bantok tribe up there, in one of the indigenous Igorot tribes. We met with one of the vice president of indigenous peoples, and he gave me, I showed you the books he gave me. He gave me all sorts of things to learn from. And so my dad, this whole time too, was like, I had no idea. So it was really cool to see that, to learn about our ancestors. But for me, it's all about where we come from helps us know who we're supposed to be today. And that's, I think, an principle that anybody can learn from, is we are today because of people before us. And knowing that helps shape our identity. The first question for you that you can kind of take in any direction, as you've dove into the indigenous culture in the Philippines, one, what has been some of the most surprising things that you've learned that maybe you had no idea before, where you're like, wow, I had no idea that this was part of our ancestry, our lineage. And how has it changed how you govern yourself today? How does that change how you live today? That if you didn't discover those things about your indigenous culture, you wouldn't be the same. Does that make sense? What have you learned that has impacted who you are?
Well, the thing that I sort of had an idea of and I sort of knew in my heart, but didn't have proof of, is sort of like you with the breath of life. I knew that we were connected to all the island people and including those, east and west, all the way east to Rapa Nui or Easter Island, all the way west to Madagascar. We're told of these things in snippets, and we sort of know it because we can look at least part way and say, you do some of the things that we do. Our words are sort of the same here and there, but no one justified it. And so when they started doing all these genetics tests, and the Samoans were coming back and the Tongans were coming back and saying, why does it show up that I'm 70% Filipino? I'm 100% Samoan. Well, the thing is you didn't just appear on an island one day. We're all related. And one of the things that I take away that might seem a little bit over the top is I truly believe that we should have our own designation. Like they say, these people are white, these people are black, these people are Asian. We have a language and genetics that spreads amongst the island people halfway around the world. Why are we put into all these other groups when we, the Austronesians, Filipinos, whatever you want to call us, we were a basal people. And that means that there were only so many basal people. I don't know how many there are, because when I study this, they don't tell me there's like 8 basal people or whatever. But I assume there's not many. We're one of the basal people.
Can you explain basal people for us?
Basal people are a pure people according to genetics. So when you go back 50,000 years ago, there were the basal Australasians, whose modern proxy is the Aita of the Philippines, also related to the Aborigines in Australia. And then you have the Basal East Asians, which the modern proxy of that is the Igorot. Now, the Igorot, when they do a DNA test, not all Igorots, but the majority, have about 100% Austronesian or East Asian genetics. That means they don't have the genetics of all these other peoples. So if you take a Han Chinese or I think it's pronounced Dai Chinese person and you get their genetics, they're going to have a good amount of our genetics and maybe some northern basal Asian person or something, but they're not pure like us. And I don't mean that in a Hitler sort of way, like the pure Aryan race. I'm just saying one of the reasons why the Philippine people don't have, even though you're going to say, well, we mixed here, we mixed there. The people in the mountains, they didn't mix because when Spain came,
They fled. Yeah, they
a
fled.
lot of them were in the mountains, but if you wanted to stay Filipino or whatever or Austronesian, you separated yourself from the Spanish. It only makes sense, right? If you didn't want to be under the rule of Spain, you fled to the area where the Spanish couldn't get you. And so when the Spanish tried to get into those areas, they were met with fierce resistance and were never able to conquer the Igorot or mountain people. So, one of the things that and I read about this in a post earlier. One of the things that the Philippine government doesn't understand when they want to try to take away IP, indigenous peoples' rights, lands, or resources is the reason why they don't control that area is because nobody ever took it in war. The Spanish never had great control of Mindanao. The Spanish never had great control of the mountains. And so when they go up there and they say, hey, we're the Philippine government, we're together, we're going to go mine some of this, they really don't have a right because back in the day, the Igorots would have killed them. I mean, they're much more nice now, but I'm just saying back in the day, you wouldn't think about going up into the mountains because you wouldn't have your head tomorrow,
Yeah,
so
headhunters.
right. So the thing that I digress because I like to tell a exciting story, but the main thing is when you look at a people, there aren't many people in this world that are 100% anything. And so when people are grouping us with Asians or whatever, I think we're pretty well spread out and we're pretty significant enough to be our own race. There should be an Austronesian box I mean, of course, they have Pacific Islander, and I know the reason for that grouping, and they were able to maintain their heritage the way they always have, and I praise them for that because one of the ways that I can connect our peoples is seeing where we do have connection, knowing that there's a genetic link, and also saying, okay, well, we might not have all of this, but these few things that we do have show that we share ancestors, and that's important. And so to me, one of the big things is you can say white, black, Hispanic, Asian, but there should be an Austronesian.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Austronesian, and I wasn't until I started doing my research on this. I had no idea what Austronesian was, none of that before I started to dive into it. But tell us where, if you had to place where Austronesia was as a people, where did it begin? What other cultures and peoples do the Austronesians impact?
Okay. Well, like I was getting at, and I'm going to get scientific because that's the only way I can prove it, is 50,000 years ago, the genetic scientists said there were basal Australasian and there were basal East Asian. Basal East Asians came down from the mainland into the islands. When they came in is debatable. And I think if the basal Australasians and the basal East Asians existed at the same time, why would one come into the islands before the other? So I have a problem with anyone saying first until we find proof. And then what we do know, now we do know that there was a person, Homo sapien, in the Philippines 40,000 years ago with Taban Man. He wasn't negrito or small diminutive person because of the size of his bones and whatever the anthropologist used to determine that. But we don't know what his genetics were because we couldn't pull DNA from it. The earliest DNA that we could pull from a Homo sapiens in island Southeast Asia is in Sulawesi, which is just south of Mindanao and just east of Borneo. So to say that that isn't the Philippines would be crazy because I mean in a historical sense, because we're all related peoples. There was no Philippines and Indonesia in the past, or Borneo. These were just all islands with the same related people. And so the furthest proof that we have is 7,300 years ago. There was a girl that lived in Sulawesi next to Mindanao. And when they pulled her DNA, she was half Australasian and she was half East Asian. That's the oldest evidence we have. But you'll always hear people say the Negrito was first in the Philippines. But I'm going, what? If they were like from the same ancestor and they were around at the same time, why would you say that if you don't have proof? So for me, I'll be resistant for until they show me proof. But getting back to the whole point of it is our people's DNA is 100% pure in the mountains of Luzon. And as you spread further away from there, then you have people with 90%, 80%, 70%. And of course, further and further away, it becomes less Austronesian or East Asian, whichever you want to call it. Austronesian is more related to the languages we speak,
Hmm.
but East Asian is the original Austronesian. What I'm saying is the East Asians in Ancestry, Basal East Asian is where Austronesians came from.
Yeah. Okay.
So
And how far is their spread?
the
Because
spread
it
is
goes all the way through the South Pacific and everywhere. So
The spread is as far east as Easter Island, as far west as Madagascar. So Easter Island is just off the coast of South America, and Madagascar is just off the coast of Africa. But note that our DNA has been found on ancient burial remains in Africa and South America. It's just we don't find like large amounts of people or anything like that. It's just that they found it. And it's controversial, but I like to be a little bit more positive because I'm, pro pre-colonial Philippine Austronesian history. You're going to push as far as you can, even when it gets controversial. But we know for sure all the way to those two islands that I mentioned. But there have been discoveries with our blood in burials on both South America and Africa.
yeah, and you were saying this earlier just about when Spain, invaded the Philippines, and which is interesting in and of itself. I mean, that's where a lot of the family history gets diluted on my dad's side, and partly because Pineda isn't even our original last name. I think it was my great great grandfather, it might have been three greats, basically adopted Pineda as his last name to govern a province, and you had to be of Spanish descent to do that. He wasn't, and so he basically, in today's world, forged his birth certificate, so to speak, so he could govern a Spanish province. And so after that, we don't know much about our lineage before that. But there's interesting pieces to that too. Is there's so much Spanish influence, in the Philippines, but a lot of Filipinos don't have much Spanish blood. I have zero Spanish blood. I've done my DNA test. There's zero because they didn't mix really, and because I also discovered, and I'd love any insight you have on this as well, is it wasn't actually Spain motherland that conquered the Philippines. It was actually Spain via South and Central America that conquered the Philippines. So there wasn't actually a lot of Spaniards, that were here. It was modern day Mexicans, Latin Americans, and so on that were actually fighting their battles for them that came over. And I know there was a lot of back and forth there too. I also had read that, Filipinos actually brought different trade and things to South America, like coconut trees and things of that nature. So there's so much that happened in the 400 years that Spain ruled the Philippines. And I remember the first time I spoke to you, you said, our history is pretty muddled for several hundred years. I mean, just your two generations before you, your grandfather, your dad, your grandfather, war, and then before that was in, we were almost enslaved people. We were a people that were looked down upon, and then before that, that's where we get into the pre-colonial era.
Right.
So there's so much that happened, and I think that we forget that often. I think Filipinos forget that often. Is so much of the culture over there. People want to. A lot of Filipinos, I always sense they want to adopt Western culture. They want to feel Western, but their roots are really nothing but the opposite. And I find that interesting. I find the back and forth, a people without identity, that's kind of how I define it oftentimes, as Filipinos sometimes don't have an identity because it's been so back and forth with colonization and, then stints even in the modern era, under different influence, US included. So walk us through some of that.
All right. I wrote down a couple notes just so that I would remember. There was two important parts. I don't know if I should go glorification or explanation first, but I'm going to go ahead and go glorification because I want to capture the people listening to us today. One of the things that people don't realize about the Philippines, and one reason why we should be so proud about our culture and the way we were, is while people on the mainland had been enslaved and dominated for thousands and thousands of years before they came to the Philippines, you need to understand that our people were free, that they governed themselves. There was no domineering king or emperor. If you didn't like the way that we ran our village, you just went to the next island over and started your own village the way you wanted it. And the main reason that happened is, from my studies, the earliest culture of the Philippine people, and it existed up until the time the Spanish came, is we used to rule ourselves by a council of elders, a group of old guys that were respected in the village. And generally, the way that they decided upon things is they had to have consensus, and they did what was best for the village as a whole. So, for instance, sometimes capital punishment, might not have been the best solution. A lot of times we say, okay, capital punishment, eye for an eye, sort of like that. But let's say it was an accident, just to give an example. Then, of course, if it was an accident, you wouldn't want to kill that person because that person didn't kill the other person maliciously. It was an accident. Maybe he wasn't paying attention and something happened. But the main thing that I want to drive to our people and related peoples, and all these related people are our people, because if you consider your ancestors to be significant, which Philippine people and all islander people consider ancestors to be very important, that is one place where we have connection with all of our Austronesian blooded language people from South America to Africa. We all put our ancestors in regard, and it's
Mhm.
important to us. Whether you realize that or not, you can read all the books. We all think highly of our ancestors, and we think to ourselves in our ancient cultures. Of course, there were other religions and things brought in, but even though the other religions were brought in, we still had reverence for our ancestors.
That was never lost. Yeah.
Right. So, one thing that we need to remember is that we were a great people that lived freely in community with the Kapwa. And I can explain that. That's where we have a sense of one, belonging.
Yeah.
But
And I talk a lot about, as you know, Kappa in my book.
right. Okay, great. And so the thing is, the world could benefit, or let's not say the world yet. Let's say that we benefited from this lifestyle for a long time. We didn't enslave one another in the earliest cultures, and then we lived in consensus, and we had the best weather outside of a typhoon, because we had sun and rain constantly. We weren't living like people in Africa or other areas where they had drought and desert. Our lands had lots of pig and deer, so you could get meat whenever you wanted. The fruit grows from the ground. I mean, if you walk in the Philippines today, you'll see a mango over here and a jackfruit over there. I could walk for miles in Texas and never find anything to eat.
Yeah.
The fish, the sea life is the most bountiful. There is no more biodiverse sea area in the world than the Philippines. So you can find any type of fish over there, any type of seafood, because we have mountains in the Philippines. We have rain sporadically, not sporadically, but regularly. So that, just like in Hawaii, if you live in the mountains, it rains every night. So the same is true in many parts of the Philippines. It rains every night, and the water comes down as fresh springs and rivers every day. And on top of that, we had gold everywhere. And so if we wanted anything on the mainland, we could just go over there, row our boat, and we were. The latest scientific reports say that we had a deep sea mariner culture for at least 35,000 years. We had been visiting India in their historical records since before 1000 BC. So the thing is we used to boat or
Voyage.
sail or canoe to the mainland, and if they had anything we wanted, we could give them this yellow stuff that they wanted so bad, and then we would get whatever we'd trade it for food or whatever, and we'd be happy. So there's nothing in the world that Filipinos didn't have until the gun took it away from us. And when it comes to war and ancient weapons, swords, bows, spears, lances, nobody was conquering us in the past because you don't spread your DNA from one continent to the other if you're being subservient. We were living free and we basically got what we needed. I'm not going to promote war or that we were killing everybody, even though we might have. I think that was pretty common back then. But the thing is nobody took anything from us. And we had, our martial arts today are used in films,
Yeah. It's
so we knew how to fight. It was
almost
only
the
that,
highest rated,
right.
form of martial arts in the world. The military uses it, everything. Yeah.
Right. So the thing is, nobody messed with us until they had a
Guns.
nuclear bomb in a pistol. So, we had our day. We just don't remember. And one of the reasons we don't remember is because I'm sure that when the Spanish came, they took out the people that had knowledge and that were leaders. When you take over an area, you don't let them remember what was great about them.
You try to take away their history. That's
Yeah,
how
you take
colonization
away
works.
their history, you take away, you convert them to another faith, so on and so forth. So,
Language, everything. Yeah.
right. So we had it great up until 1565. And then there were hundreds of years where we were brainwashed. And so, today, a lot of people don't know about our past. And of course,
Brainwashed is the right word. It's not, I don't
right,
think that's an exaggeration. I really
right.
think that's the right word.
Well, the thing is I would say that, our people like the Bajau today, they swam like fish. And this was told about with the Bisayans, not just the Bajau, that can stay underwater for very long periods of time. But the Bisayans were known to swim like fish. And the people in Guam used to also be the same way and were like marvelous on their, what do they call those boats? But they were sort of like, barangays. But anyway, they were just swift outrigger boats and they were like captains of the sea. But then a few generations later, nobody knows how to do the stuff that they all used to know how to do, because they would kill you if you did, if, it's hard to do something when somebody can aim at you and just pull a trigger and you're dead. That's one of the reasons why people lost all that knowledge, and it's sad. It's sad that people don't know all that we could know, but there needs to be an understanding that we lived a very good life before 1565 and that our way of life outside of, tribal war, because everybody had war all over the world. Outside of war, we lived a life where people weren't necessarily subservient to other people. Now, let me explain one more thing before I let you interject. A lot of people bring in the Tagalogs and the Visayan culture, which was there 1565 when the Spanish came, but they don't realize that that culture was Indianized with the Hindu Buddhist influence. And that's not our original culture either. And so, what I'm trying to say is the Indians and the Hindus and the Bisayans and Tagalogs, they had already been influenced to treat some of the people as beneath them. There was already a hierarchy or a caste system. And so when I talk about Spain and what they did to the people is even today, there are people who run the country that don't treat other Austronesian or Filipino people as equals. They look at them as servants that they can take advantage of. And that's sad. And I don't think the Pacific Islanders look at their people that way. And that was brought in from outside
Yeah.
because that was um the Majinu and then Mar Harlequin and then
Yeah.
the Alipin.
It's, social classes and very much, there's definitely classes in indigenous cultures, but the way that the world understands social classes is very much a Western ideology. And I think you're right. I think that it is sad that, in the Philippines today, people of their own people, they see themselves as lesser than or greater than. And you're right. I don't think other island cultures do that. And a bunch of things that you said that I want to remark on because I think it's really important when you say, you know, at a certain time period before, what did you say, 15? What was it before
1565.
before 1565? Filipinos had it good. Our ancestors had it great. And much like any colonization throughout all the islands, throughout, North and South America, when, we'll say when white men came and colonized, it wasn't a pretty thing. And they stripped culture away from people. And then they referred to these people as savages, oftentimes. They referred to them as less than, in multiple different ways. But when you actually learn, and this goes for any indigenous culture, Native Americans to South Central Americans, island peoples, much of their culture and how they ran their society, we'll say it, was very sophisticated, and it worked. And it worked well. Like you said, the Council of Elders, we could learn a great deal from that ideology today. People leading villages on cities that way. And, when I was, and then I want to talk about wartime as well, because you said, sure, they had war, but even the way they did war was with a reverence to it that was deeper than just bloodshed like today. Modern warfare is bloodshed, and there's no respect in it at all. And for example, when I was talking to one of these tribal leaders in the Bontoc tribe up in Baguio, they were explaining some of the indigenous wartime to me. And I didn't know all of these pieces. But, for example, they would do everything they could to prevent war first. And it was always over land or over, somebody wronged somebody else. But they would have women communicate in between tribes, is what he was saying, because you weren't to harm women, right? So it wasn't like again, some modern warfare where people go through and rape and pillage and do all of that. I mean, there was this respect and regard for women and children, and each other's crops. So they wouldn't actually damage and pillage each other's crops. They wouldn't harm that. So there was a way of doing war that was respectful. And then people say, well, what about the headhunters? That's pretty gruesome. But also, Filipino, as I've learned, the energy, in the Pacific Islands, they call it mana, but this spiritual energy that people have, indigenous Philippines believed it was in the head. And so when they were headhunters, they would go get the heads. Sure, it was kind of like a token as a warrior, like you got a head and what have you, but they would actually bring them back to their villages and put them in a sacred place in the village, the head, because they contained this spiritual energy. So there was even this reverence to why they got the head. In our modern world, we think, that's so gruesome, a headhunter chopping off heads, but there was still this deeper meaning behind the head and showing respect to that person in warfare by placing their head in a sacred place because that contained this sort of spiritual energy. And so we look at all of these past customs and we might label it as savage, or that was whatever you call it, which is a huge token of disrespect in my opinion, because the way that they actually ran their society, we'll call it, was far more sophisticated, in my opinion, than a lot of Western cultures. And even when I was speaking with this tribal leader, like you said, the Council of Elders, he was saying it wasn't like blood descent. It wasn't because you were from some specific social class. You earned the right to lead, and you earned the right to lead in your tribe or your village because of what, and you said this earlier, because of what you did for other people, your service that you did to them, and people wanted you to lead because you basically earned it. And he had a word for it that I write about in my book. I can't pronounce it very well because it's in their indigenous dialect, but
Right.
I talk about it in my book, and that was the term. It's you earned the right to lead. It wasn't like some right and you didn't have this silver spoon in your mouth as a kid because you were
Right,
from
it wasn't it
royal
wasn't
descent.
based on who your father was.
Yeah, it was you earned the right to lead. So I know I'm bouncing all over the place, but it stems from your remark that before a certain time period, Philippines had it good. It wasn't a
Well,
lesser than time.
let me interject one more thing about how good it was before we move forward, just because I know we're gonna probably move forward. But what the historians say is the Spanish and their cronies took the best land and the resources and then huddled everybody up into cities. So cities are meant to keep people controlled in an area, and they can only survive if they take a job that the Spanish or whomever give them. And that's true today. I'm not saying that the rest of the world would be like the Philippines or island Southeast Asia, but I can tell you for us, there's no better place to be or live a carefree lifestyle because the food is so abundant. You know, in other areas, they had war because they didn't have rain. In other areas, they had war because they had no cattle or deer or pig. In other areas, they didn't have any vegetables or fruit. That's never been the case in the Philippines yesterday or today. Never. So the thing is, and I'm not a proponent of, necessarily, extreme forms of birth control or anything like that. But even the Bisayans used to have a method or herb or something that they used to use so that you wouldn't have too many babies. And so the thing is, of course we can't support maybe as many people as we have now, or maybe, it's a little more difficult now, but back then there was more than enough food for us, in the Philippines. And like I said, I mean, we work in the cities now. You and I are here on a computer because we have to find a way, of course, things that we enjoy, but we have to find a way to make money so that we can buy the food. But if I were to be living in the Philippines again, um, and I plan to, my plan is to have all the fruits and vegetables lined up on my land, and I'm going to be growing it, and then I'm probably not going to go deep sea fishing or something, but I can go to the market and buy the fresh fish that was caught yesterday or today.
Mhm.
And so, I can have all of it at a good price and live happily. And what I'm trying to say is that our ancestors had a much more relaxed, more in tune with the earth life then
Lifestyle.
than we have now. I mean, most of us dream of not having to work all day and sit back at the beach and go do something that we like. The only reason we do this is because we've set ourselves up with debt or whatever that we have to do this. But if you can learn to live with a little less, but you've got a great, if you have land like in the Philippines that's so fertile and abundant with food, you wouldn't have to work as much and you could spend more time with your family. And so, like I say, a lot of people are going to say negative things about the old ways, but one of the things that we should realize, this is what I try to tell people. When people look at the indigenous people of the Philippines, or they look at the culture of the way that we were, they're sort of looking at it in today's sense. Like, okay, look at the Igorots in their Bahag G strings, okay, today. And they're still doing it for ceremonial purposes, but they're comparing that to a guy on a computer today. If you look at the Spanish in the 1500s, they weren't so advanced. The only thing they had was a gun. I mean, they didn't cook any better than us. They didn't have microwaves or telephones or anything like that. So when we look back and we say, "Oh, that was us before," you need to also look at the Spanish before. Their boats weren't any better than ours. They were just more robust so that they could carry cannons. But our boats were taking us to to three continents.
Mhm.
I don't have any record or proof of them going to Australia, but I'm sure they could have. But they definitely went all the way to South America and Africa. One other thing to poke at my Austronesian brothers and sisters, Polynesians and so forth, and it's not a negative, but just a little bit of a poke, just so that they know, is until you get past like the Tonga area and you get much closer to South America, the majority and the earliest of their genetics is Austronesian or Filipino. I like to put in the jab of the Filipino because there's only one 100% Austronesian, and that's a Filipino. So the thing is, when a Samoan is 76, 75% Filipino, and their earliest burials are Filipino or Austronesian, then what that basically tells you is that there were Filipinos or people from the Philippines on those islands early on, but they admixed with the Papuans or Melanesians later on. And because that mixture is less than 50%, you know that the majority were Austronesian. Because you can't, like you yourself, you're 50% German European and 50% Austronesian Filipino. If you were 75%, that means that your mom might have been half German and half Filipino, and then you would have 75%. So what I'm trying to say is there were much more Filipinos or Austronesians in Samoa than there were Papuans or whatever Australasian group you want to say. And that's not necessarily a big jab. I'm just trying to get the connection. When I jab at Polynesians and Tongans and Samoans, I don't at them to be mean. I jab at them to say, hey, we share ancestors, and we should, rather than we need Samoans and Tongans to help us see where we have that connection and to learn what we've lost.
Exactly. That's
And
the
then
great way to put it, to help
and
us
then
learn what we lost.
and then when we have a common battle, we need to join together, because one of the reasons why the Philippines fell, and this is going back to the Spanish, and why we don't have a lot of Spanish blood, is because unlike Mexico, a lot of them were conquered because of disease. We weren't conquered with disease because we had already been around the world. We were conquered because it was divide and conquer. They took the Bisayans. Well, the Bisayans had already been hurt by an ally of the Tagalogs in the Dutch when they had come by before the Spanish got there. And the Dutch and another, I think it was a tribe on one of the Spice Islands, they came and wiped out some people in Bohol and other areas. And so after that happened, when the Spanish came to Bohol, they looked at the Spanish as a new ally, and then they attacked the Tagalogs in Manila. And so the Spanish would have never taken over Manila if it hadn't been for them working with the Science. So, we did it to ourselves. So, I mean, it's sad, but that's sort of what happens is, you get one
History.
tribe to
Yeah.
fight against the other.
Yeah, well, it's history, and every day, every decade we're making history for our posterity. And we're kind of coming to the end of our hour. We're going to have to do a round 2 cuz there's so much more I want to get into
Yeah.
with you. So
I
we'll have
mean,
to do another episode, but I want to get your kind of your final statement on what, cuz I think most people that are probably going to listen to this episode are, island peoples, Filipino peoples. But for whoever's listening, I want them to kind of walk away with how can knowing our ancestry, even back, indigenous cultures, help us live less transactionally today, right? I'd love for you to answer that. First, I want to kind of share what it means to me, and then you can share that, and we'll wrap up. The reason I wrote this book was because we discovered some amazing things in the community where I was working at the time, and we brought people together in pretty incredible ways. And I felt as though I had this fully funded research opportunity for multiple years. I feel a responsibility to share what we learned with others. But personally, everything that changed and was catalyzed was because of my looking back on my past and my ancestors and learning from them. It really catalyzed key moments in the story, and you'll read about those moments in the book. And one day, I hope that this book can be a book that generations will look back on because of a unique position that I'm in, and the unique position I'm in, it is genetic, so to speak. I have 50% of my lineage that are from these indigenous tribes and peoples that we've spoken about. Many, many years of colonization, etc. in that. But before that, indigenous peoples. The other side, I have the colonizers. So my lineage in and of itself is a conflict of interest, and not just my religious beliefs, as a Christian, but also these things I've been learning from my indigenous past. I do believe one day that I will get to meet these ancestors, and they will meet me on both sides. And I feel as though I have a responsibility, because I don't think that one day everybody's just going to get along. I feel as though I have a responsibility to bring people together, even at that time, with my two different, very different, family trees, the colonizers and the colonized, and bringing people together. And I hope that my book, can stand as a beacon in that world, even where 100 years from now, people will read it and say, look, here was an author that actually he was half and half, and he found a way to bridge some of these Western cultures and indigenous cultures together to help people today. And that's really kind of one of the deep reasons behind writing the book is I feel a responsibility to share the technical things that I learned in the research, but I feel this timeless responsibility to bridge these cultures and bring people together, not just in this life, but in the next. And that's, that's a very special thing to me. But there's so much that we can learn from indigenous cultures. That can help us today. For you, if you had to put it in a statement, what is one of the most important things that anybody listening, no matter which part of the world they come from, how can they learn from their ancestors to help them become better today?
Well, let me touch on one thing that you had mentioned just so that I can bridge the gap before I make my statement. You had mentioned that you had a Christian faith, and one of the reasons why the Igorot and Mountain people eventually adopted Christianity, not Catholicism, is because when they heard the stories of the Christians, they heard the story of their sky god, the Father, and his son who came to visit the earth. And this is very true with the Bontok. The Bontok have Lumawig, or you could say Lumawig, who came to earth and lived with man before he went back to the sky. And there are surprisingly, with many tribes from north to south in the Philippines, many stories that align with the Old Testament. So I already gave you that Kabunyan was the father god in the sky, and Lumawig was his son that came to earth. But did you know that they had a ladder of someone trying to get to heaven, and God destroyed it and scattered them so that they had many languages? Did you know that there's many tribes that had a flood story, and the only survivor was somebody that was on the top of the tallest mountain? And did you know that there was a story of, I can't remember her name, but there was like a girl in a garden, the first man and the first woman. A snake came to them and told them to eat of the fruit, and once they ate the fruit, then God no longer spoke to them anymore.
Yeah,
So what I'm trying to say is there's more than one biblical story that matches up with Philippine ancient culture. And
100%.
we can go into that if you want to at some point. I can.
Well, I love you brought that because the book I have in front of me is
Right, right,
The
with
Forgotten
Maui.
Children of Maui.
Right,
And, I'm reading this story too about Lumawig, and, it says Lumawig taught the Bontoc people a moral code. Some of the provisions of the code are one must not steal, one should not lie or
right,
gossip, men and women must not commit adultery, one must be temperate in eating and drinking alcoholic drinks, all people must live simple and industrious lives, all people should live as brothers.
right,
If you compare these principles to something like the Ten Commandments,
right. They're
there's so
identical
much
in a
connection.
sense. Right.
And, the whole premise of this book was, there's these stories of Maui all over the
Pacific Island.
Pacific Islands. There sometimes throughout the islands, the tales change a little bit. And in the Philippines, sometimes the names are a little different,
Right,
but it's the same story about
right.
the same individual, Maui here. And I like the connection you put Maui, Maui
In
is
that.
in there, and you cross-reference if you're a Christian, you cross-reference to the different things, you can
Right.
see a common thread. Again, so I think you go back far enough, we're talking about the same stories, the same
Right.
individuals, the same
There are a
principles.
lot of stories that match. And it's not every tribe, it's not every people's, but the thing is that number 1, they're all genetically connected, and then number 2, you see that the stories are similar from north to south. It's not just only in the north or only in the south. It's from north to south, and it's not every tribe, but it's enough of them to make a significant point.
Yeah. So your
But
statement, let's
so the
hear what.
my basic statement is we need to be proud of who we are, because you need to have pride in who you are to have confidence to succeed. You need to be proud and know the reason why people aren't proud to be Filipinos because they don't know who they are. The reason why they think the West is so good is because they think, oh, well, we got conquered and so we're less. But if you knew how well we lived, if you knew that our martial arts were superior to many other people's, and the proof of that is that you can find our DNA spread from one side of the world to the other before 1521. And so the thing is, you don't do that if you were a meek and small people. You do that because you lived a good life and you knew how to enjoy life without, necessarily dominating other people's. I mean, we probably did dominate in a sense because we moved around, but the thing is our culture was more about the kapwa, more about helping one another, and that if we didn't agree, then you could go live over there on your own and we wouldn't bother you, you know? So it was a live and let live and live well type of lifestyle. But if you don't know how good we had it and how much we accomplished before the gun changed things, and the gun didn't just change things for us, it changed things for everybody around the world.
Everyone.
We only suffered more recently what all the people in Italy and Greece had suffered a long time ago, and that is, subjugation from an overlord, And so we shouldn't, be, how would you say, ashamed that our time for defeat happened. We should be proud that we lived great for so long in a better world. And then now we need to take the knowledge of what we still remember and make the world a better place. And, I've sort of explained this to you before, but to me, the solution for business in the world is to, outside of faith, is to have a kapwa type business. And what I mean by that is instead of having an investor invest in your company, why not have your workers invest in the company? There's many companies now like Publix and Shields and however you pronounce that, Huawei,
Winco.
that are employee owned or worker owned. It makes economic sense. I studied economics in school. If you have a worker that is an owner, then the business isn't going to take advantage of the worker because he owns it, and vice versa. The worker's not going to take advantage of the business if he owns it. So it makes perfect sense. It's like an entrepreneurship, times 1 million. And I look at that as a solution. I'm not saying that it's perfect. It's not going to work in every business, but I
Yeah.
think it's the way forward. And that actually takes our old ways into consideration.
Yeah. It's bringing the past to the present in a new way. Well, Arthur, we're serious. We're gonna have to do round two again because there's so
Okay.
much more we could dive into.
Yeah, just think of the questions that you might have. I'm sure I can answer them in some way, shape, or form. I'll flash this up here. Here's issue number 1 of Maharlikan Chronicles, and I've got the others here, 4, 3, and 2.
Yeah,
So
they
if
look
you
awesome.
wanna introduce our history to someone in your family that's not boring like a big thick book with a lot of letters,
That's
then
the way to do it.
and by the way, these comics were hand drawn in the Philippines.
Love that.
Yeah.
Love that. Yeah, we'll be sure to put a link there too when we post everything. But be sure to follow Arthur on Instagram. Igorot Sky again is his
Igorot.sky, Maharlikan
Igorot.sky's handle.
Chronicles, Pre-Colonial Philippines.com.
Yeah, precolonialphilippines.com, a wealth of knowledge, all sort of self-taught, and I love that about you, and I appreciate your time. Salamat po, across the board. Just thank you so much. And until next time too, because we're going to do round two, but to listeners, thanks for tuning in, and until next time, be safe. Thanks.